Hello students, this week we'll be talking about author's logic. Specifically, what is an author's logic, what are logical fallacies, and how can you find if an author's reasoning is fallacious or if it is a fallacy. To start things off, what is an author's logic? An author's logic is their basis of reasoning for why they say that something is true. So you're basically just looking at an argument that the author is saying and seeing whether that argument really makes sense, if it's reasonable, and that's basically what you're doing. So logic is actually used to help test whether something is true or if it's false. So in that case, logic is basically like a helpful tool that you can use to help find truth, to see if that argument is correct. But just as another note there is that just because it's helpful to find truth, it's never guaranteed to always point you toward the correct answer. Just because you might not have all the facts that you might need, you might not have all the variables and things like that, maybe you misinterpreted a fact. So logic is helpful, it's a helpful tool, but it doesn't always guarantee that something is correct. You have to kind of keep that in mind. But the best way to figure out if something is true is to combine all the facts, if you can get all the facts, with good logic, and that is usually the best way to figure out if something is true or false. Also, another note there is that not all reasoning is considered logical. There is illogical arguments that don't really hold up reasonably. So any logic that is flawed in nature is actually considered a fallacy, which we will be looking more into here in a second. So now let's look at what logical fallacies really are and what fallacies you're most likely to kind of run into as you see different arguments and whatnot from different authors and in life. So logical fallacies are errors, again, in logic due to faulty arguments or arguments that have flaws in them or irrelevant points. So they might just be talking about something that's relevant, or their argument itself just doesn't really make sense. And with either of those, or if it's not backed with evidence, you will have some faulty arguments and you'll have logical fallacies. So here is a list of some common logical fallacies. List for your notes purposes, list at least 5 of these, but I'm going to go ahead and read through 10 common fallacies that you will likely see at some point in the near future. So we have the first one here called ad hominem. This is when someone doing an argument verbally attacks the individual instead of actually debating the topic. So it's kind of a way to avoid the topic. They don't want to, maybe their argument isn't very good or they know they're wrong or something. So instead of answering the question, instead of debating the topic, they will choose to instead just like insult their opponent. That is called ad hominem. So that is the first logical fallacy or error in logic that you might run into. Next, you have an appeal to authority. This is when someone basically says that something is true just because some sort of authority figure says that it's true. That might be a good point, that if an authority says it's true, I mean, it's good to note, but just because an authority figure says it's true doesn't mean it's true. So that is actually flawed reasoning. Next one is something called the straw man. That's what they call this fallacy. That is when someone makes up a weak argument, says that their opponent supports that argument even if they don't, which they probably don't, and then they quote unquote knock down that argument. So they basically make up a dumb argument, say that their opponent supports that argument, and then they obviously very easily win that argument basically with themselves. Kind of a silly one, but that is something that you might see, and they call that the straw man logical fallacy, and I'm sure you'll see it at some point if you notice. Another one, number 4 there, is an appeal to ignorance. This is when someone says that because there's no evidence for or against something, that it must be true. Obviously, this is not true. Just because we don't know if something's true doesn't make it true or false. We just don't know. So that is a fallacy. That's number 4. Then you have 5, false dilemma. This is when somebody says that there's only 2 options to choose from when really there may be actually more. So they say, oh, you're either for me or against me, when really there might be like an in-between of that, or might be a completely different thing. So that is another fallacy. Then number 6, you have something called the slippery slope. This is saying that one thing leads to another thing, which leads to another thing, when it doesn't. Usually there's not going to be a lot of evidence supporting that one thing leads to another. So they just kind of have this domino effect of, oh, if you do this, then this happens, then this happens. And it just, if there isn't evidence supporting that, then it's going to be obviously a fallacy as well. So that is what they call this slippery slope, that you kind of slide down the slope of domino effect of things going on when there really isn't evidence backing that. Then 7 there is something called a circular argument you might have heard of. That is that you're basically saying something is true because it is true. Obviously, that doesn't really make sense. It's just the circle argument. There's not really evidence supporting or anything like that. But that is something you might hear. Number 8 is kind of a funny one. It's called alphabet soup. That's when somebody uses big words and acronyms to sound smart, so that people actually assume that they're right. Obviously, that's just because you use big words doesn't mean you're right. So obviously that is a fallacy, but people will do it to try to win an argument just by sounding fancy. Then 9, the bandwagon. This is that saying is something is true because most people think it's true. Obviously this is also not true because there might be, the majority of people might actually be wrong. So that would be wrong. That's bandwagon. And then 10, a red herring. This is when you take an argument off topic to avoid answering the question being discussed. You basically, if it's asking you about one thing, you just kind of don't really answer it. You just go on a different sidetrack there to avoid answering it. Obviously, that would be not a logical argument toward that because you're completely avoiding it. So that is a fallacy as well. So these are 10 different fallacies that you will see at some point in arguments and whatnot. So just keep an eye out for those. But that is, so you basically just want to keep an eye out to identify those so you know if something is logical or if it is fallacious. So now that we've looked at a bunch of fallacies and whatnot that you might see in different arguments, how can you actually find if an author's reasoning is fallacious, if it has flaws, or if it is reasonable, if it's a good argument? So there's a few steps you can do here. First, you want to identify what their argument actually is, what are they for and against, and then you want to go through steps 2 through 4 here and see if all of these are correct. So we'll look at number 2 here. See if they're addressing the argument or avoiding it somehow. So if they're somehow avoiding the argument, they might do this in a few ways. They might try to attack the person, they might just change the subject, they might do something else. But if they're doing any of those kind of things, avoiding the topic and argument, then that is one indicator that it's a fallacy. Next, the next step to see, number 3, is to see if the argument makes logical sense. So something like the circular argument, where they just say, this is true because it's true. It just doesn't really make sense completely because you don't have that evidence and things like that. So you have to see if it makes logical sense as step number 3. And then the last step there is to see if their argument is backed with good evidence. Evidence being obviously a big proponent to see if something is true and correct. So checking to see if they are actually using facts in their argument is very important. So as that last little bullet point there, if you answered no to steps 2, 3, or 4, so any of those, then their argument is a fallacy. It is flawed. So they have to be, their argument has to be on topic, it has to be logical, and it has to be backed with evidence to be considered a good argument and not be considered a fallacy. And that's it. So if you can go through those and identify if they're on topic, logical, and backed with evidence, then good. They do have a good argument. Otherwise, it is a fallacy, and that is a good thing to note. Okay, so the last thing we're going to look at today is some argument examples to see whether these are good arguments or if they're fallacies. So we're going to kind of go through those steps like we mentioned and just try to see if they're good or bad. So we're going to pretend like this is the question that's being asked, and then 1 through 5 are basically potential answers to this question. So the question is, how will we as a country be more environmentally friendly? So let's see if these answers 1 through 5 are good or if they are fallacies. Number 1, the environment is important, but these environmentalists want to make everything harder so the manufacturing industries will go out of business. Here we see that they are basically avoiding the topic a little bit here by pointing to environmentalists and whatnot, so they're kind of using a red herring as well as just kind of making it about the other person and bashing them. So that is going to be a fallacy. Number 2, no one really knows the best way to save our environment, so we can't move forward to make any significant changes. This is the appeal to ignorance fallacy that we mentioned earlier, just saying that nobody really knows, so we can't do anything. And that is kind of that appeal to ignorance. Really, you can do something, so that is a fallacy as well. Number 3, the environment is important, but other countries keep dumping their trash in the ocean. This is another example of avoiding the topic by pointing to someone else, basically, and avoiding the topic in that way. Number 4, the environment is important and complex, but if everyone works to do simple things like recycling, some progress will be made. Here I would say that technically for this question, it actually is a good argument, because the question is just asking what will we as a country do to be more environmentally friendly, and that is a way that the country can be more environmentally friendly by recycling. The only thing I would say is that if this question was geared toward, like if a politician was answering this, for example, this might be considered a red herring, or it might be considered avoiding the topic if what they're really asking in the question is what policies are they going to change in the country to support environmental friendliness and whatnot. So if that's really what they mean by the question, then this would be kind of an instance of avoiding it. But otherwise, technically, that is answering the question, so it wouldn't be a fallacy. And then we have number 5 here. We've discovered ways to limit pollution in manufacturing companies, so we plan on enforcing some new, stricter policies in that industry to keep our air clean. So this is not a fallacy because they are answering the question. It makes sense. They're using evidence because they're mentioning that they've discovered ways to limit pollution, so there is evidence. It makes sense that that would clean the air, so it's logical. And they're not avoiding the topic, they are answering it, so 5 would be the best answer for sure, but 4 is also a pretty good one, though it might be slightly avoiding the topic, so it's kind of borderline a fallacy, but technically it might be good. But anyway, that is a few examples of finding if an argument is good or if it's a fallacy. So hopefully you can do this as well whenever you see an author's argument to see if what they're saying really is logical and points toward truth, or if they're avoiding the topic, if what they're saying makes sense, if it's backed with evidence, and all that good stuff. That is it for this video, and I'll see you next time.